Hello there, and welcome to a journey through time unlike any other. Tonight, we're going to travel together far back into Earth's ancient past, to a world that existed long before the first cities rose, before humans learned to plant seeds in the ground, before the familiar rhythm of 4 distinct seasons. We're returning to a time when winter stretched across continents and never truly ended, when silence blanketed vast landscapes, broken only by the distant crack of shifting ice and the soft, deliberate footfalls of creatures that no longer walk this earth. Take a moment to settle in wherever you are, whether you're listening in the quiet hours before dawn, seeking refuge from a busy day, or simply looking for a peaceful place to rest your thoughts. There's no hurry here. We're going to move slowly through this ancient landscape, at the pace of deep time itself, where changes happened so gradually that entire generations lived and died without ever noticing the world was transforming around them. The Ice Age wasn't a single moment of freeze, a sudden plunge into cold that locked the world in winter. It was an era that unfolded over millions of years, a slow and patient dance between ice and earth, between cold and the life that learned to endure it. This was a time when glaciers breathed across continents, advancing and retreating in cycles so vast that they reshaped the very bones of the planet we know today. Imagine for a moment what it would feel like to breathe that ancient air. Cold and sharp, carrying the clean scent of snow, even in what passed for summer. Picture yourself standing on ground that crunched beneath your feet with frost that never quite melted away, looking out toward horizons not filled with forests or rolling hills, but dominated by walls of ice that stretched beyond sight, ancient and patient as mountains, yet always slowly, imperceptibly moving. This frozen world was home to creatures that seem almost mythical to us now. Woolly mammoths with tusks that curved like crescent moons, their thick coats rippling in the endless wind, their breath visible in clouds that hung in the perpetual cold. Cave lions, twice the size of any cat alive today, padding silently across snow-covered plains in search of prey. Giant ground sloths that moved like living boulders through landscapes where time itself seemed to move differently. But this wasn't a dead world, despite the cold. It was a world very much alive, filled with the quiet drama of survival, adaptation, and the endless creativity of life, finding ways to persist in conditions that would seem impossible. Small bands of early humans learned to make fire against the dark, to craft tools from stone and bone, to read the movements of herds across vast grasslands that stretched from one horizon to the other. You might wonder what sounds filled that ancient world, not the constant hum of machines we know today, but something deeper, more fundamental. The whisper of wind across endless snow, the distant rumble of glaciers settling under their own immense weight, the crack of ice breaking free from frozen cliffs, and underneath it all, a profound silence that spoke of space and time on a scale almost beyond imagination. As we journey together through this frozen realm, we'll walk alongside those early humans as they follow mammoth herds across steppes so vast that they seem to merge with the sky itself. We'll listen to the night sounds of a world where saber-toothed cats stalked through darkness lit only by stars and the occasional dance of aurora across polar skies. We'll feel the patient power of glaciers carving valleys that still hold rivers today, and witness the slow retreat of ice that would eventually give birth to the world we inhabit now.
There's something deeply peaceful about connecting with this ancient rhythm, this slower pace of change. In our modern world of instant communication and rapid transformation, there's comfort in imagining a time when change happened so gradually it was almost imperceptible, when the important things, survival, cooperation, The careful tending of fire against the dark required patience and presence rather than speed. Tonight, we're going to let ourselves be carried by that ancient rhythm. We'll explore this frozen world not as distant observers, but as quiet visitors, walking carefully through landscapes of ice and snow, pausing to watch great herds move across plains that seem to go on forever, listening to stories told around fires that burned bright against the endless night. So breathe deeply, let your shoulders relax, and prepare to step back across thousands of years to a time when the world wore ice like a great white cloak, when survival was an art form, and when the patient forces of nature wrote the first chapters of the story that would eventually become our own. The journey into the frozen past begins now, and there's no need to hurry. Time moves differently here, measured not in hours or days, but in the slow advance and retreat of ice, in the gradual migration of herds, in the patient accumulation of snow that would, grain by grain, season by season, transformed the face of the earth itself. The air in that ancient world would have tasted different on your tongue, crisp and thin, with the metallic edge that comes with deep cold. You might have seen your breath forming crystals that caught what little light filtered through the perpetual overcast sky. The ground beneath your feet would have felt solid, permanently frozen, supporting the weight of creatures so massive that their footprints would remain pressed into the earth long after they passed. In the distance, you would have heard sounds that no human ear will ever hear again. The low, rumbling calls of mammoth families communicating across miles of open steppe. The howl of direwolves, deeper and more haunting than any wolf cry today. And sometimes, in the deep of night, the grinding groan of glaciers settling, a sound so low it was felt as much as heard, reminding all who lived there that the ice was always moving, always changing, patient as eternity itself. This is where our journey begins, in this world of endless white horizons and ancient silences. We'll move through it slowly, respectfully, taking time to understand not just how this world looked, but how it felt, how it sounded, how it shaped the lives of everything that called it home. There's no destination we need to reach, no test waiting at the end. This is simply an exploration, a quiet walk through time, guided by the gentle rhythm of a world that knew how to wait. So settle back. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of those ancient seasons, and prepare to see the earth as it once was, raw, vast, and beautiful in its frozen majesty. Welcome to the Ice Age.
Before the world turned white, before glaciers carved their patient signatures across continents, the earth wore a gentler face. If you could have walked through that earlier world, you would have found forests stretching where tundra would later reign, and temperate grasslands rolling across regions that would one day lie buried beneath miles of ice. Our world breathed with a different rhythm then, warmer and more forgiving, yet already carrying within it the seeds of the great transformation to come. The change began not with any dramatic event, but with something so subtle that no living creature could have detected it. Far above the Earth's atmosphere, invisible forces were slowly shifting the planet's relationship with the Sun. Our world's orbit, never quite a perfect circle, was gradually stretching into a longer, more elliptical path. The tilt of Earth's axis, that gentle lean that gives us our seasons, was slowly decreasing, causing northern summers to receive less of the sun's warming energy. These were changes measured not in years or decades, but in millennia, a single human lifetime would pass without any noticeable difference in temperature or season. Children would grow to adulthood, have children of their own, and pass away, all while the world continued its imperceptible drift toward a colder future. It was a transformation so gradual that it seemed like constancy itself. Yet nature began to respond in ways both subtle and profound. Summer seasons that had once reliably melted the previous winter's snow began to weaken. Each year, a little more snow lingered in the shadows of northern mountains. A little more ice remained unmelted in the highest valleys. At first, these patches were small, hardly noticeable against the vast expanse of greenlands below. But ice, once it begins to accumulate, creates its own momentum. You would have seen the first signs in the high places where thin air and altitude made the cold bite deeper. Snow that had always melted by midsummer began to persist through the warm months, growing dirty and hard as it aged. Layer by layer, season after season, these remnants grew heavier and more permanent. The weight of accumulating snow pressed down on itself, squeezing out air and transforming loose flakes into dense, blue-white ice. In those early millennia of change, the difference would have been visible only to the most observant. Perhaps a hunter tracking game through mountain passes might have noticed that certain high valleys stayed white longer than his grandfather remembered. Maybe a gatherer collecting berries would have found that some slopes that once bore fruit now remained too cold, their growing seasons shortened by lingering patches of old snow. But ice is patient, and ice remembers. Each winter that deposited more snow than summer could take away added to a growing reservoir of cold. The brilliant white surface of these expanding patches reflected sunlight back to space instead of allowing it to warm the ground, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the cooling. Where once dark earth had absorbed the sun's energy, now gleaming ice sent it away unused.
The glaciers that began to form in those distant mountains were more than frozen water. They were patient architects, sculptors working on a scale of time that dwarfed any human understanding, reshaping entire continents with the slow, irresistible force of accumulated ice. If you could have witnessed their work across thousands of years, you would have seen them as living entities, breathing and shifting, growing and retreating, but always carving their mark into the bones of the earth itself. Picture standing before one of these ancient glaciers at its full power. The wall of ice rising before you would have stretched upward until it seemed to merge with the sky itself, a cliff of blue and white that hummed with quiet energy. This was not the static ice of a frozen pond, but something dynamic and alive. You would have heard it working, the deep groans and cracks as massive sections shifted under their own weight, the sharp reports that echoed like thunder when internal stresses finally released, and underneath it all, the constant whisper of movement too slow for the eye to detect, but too powerful for anything to resist. These glaciers were born from the simple accumulation of snow, but they became something far more complex and formidable. As each winter's snowfall compressed the layers beneath, the bottom deposits transformed under pressure into dense crystalline ice. This ice was different from anything you might find in your freezer today. It was old ice, patient ice, ice that had learned to flow like a viscous river while maintaining the hardness of stone. The weight of these ice sheets was almost impossible to comprehend. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet grew to cover nearly all of what we now know as Canada, extending south into the heart of the continent with a mass so enormous that it actually pressed the Earth's crust downward, creating depressions that persist to this day.
The ice over Hudson Bay reached thicknesses of nearly 2 miles, and weight equivalent to pressing a mountain range down onto the landscape and then adding a mountain range on top. But weight alone was not what made these glaciers such powerful shapers of the world. It was their movement, slow but relentless, that carved the features we still recognize in our modern landscape. As they flowed outward from their centers of accumulation, they scraped and gouged the bedrock beneath them, picking up boulders and grinding them against the underlying stone like sandpaper made of mountains. The sound of this process, if you could have heard it across the centuries, would have been both subtle and overwhelming. Not a violent crashing, but a continuous grinding, like the world's largest millstone working through granite and schist and limestone, reducing solid rock to powder and pebbles. The glaciers plucked chunks of bedrock from cliff faces and carried them along, sometimes for hundreds of miles, before depositing them in places where they had no geological right to exist. You would have seen the evidence of their passage everywhere the ice had been. Valleys that had once been narrow, V-shaped cuts carved by rivers became broad, U-shaped troughs scored out by the passage of ice. The glaciers straightened river courses that had meandered for millions of years, eliminated hills that had stood since the world was young, and created new topography with each mile they advanced.
The most dramatic transformations happened where the ice met resistance. Mountain ranges that tried to block the glacier's path were carved and sculpted into forms of stark beauty. Peaks were sharpened into knife-edge ridges called arêtes. Valleys were deepened and widened until they became the dramatic gorges we admire today. Where multiple glaciers converged from different valleys, they carved out vast amphitheaters called cirques, bowl-shaped depressions that would later cradle alpine lakes. As the ice moved, it created its own weather systems. The massive bulk of the glaciers cooled the air around them, creating persistent high-pressure zones that deflected storm systems and created their own patterns of wind and precipitation. Standing near one of these ice sheets, you would have felt the katabatic winds, cold air flowing down off the glacier surface like an invisible waterfall, carrying the bitter scent of ancient ice and the mineral dust of ground rock. The glaciers were not uniform in their behavior. Some moved faster than others, depending on their size, the slope of the land beneath them, and the amount of meltwater lubricating their base. The fastest-moving sections, called ice streams, could advance several feet per day, a pace that seems glacial to us, but represented breakneck speed in the world of ice. These streams carved out the deepest channels and carried the most debris, becoming highways for the transport of boulders and sediment across vast distances. Where the glaciers finally met their limits, where the rate of melting finally balanced the rate of advance, they left behind some of their most dramatic signatures. Terminal moraines, great ridges of rock and gravel, marked their farthest reach like the ramparts of an ancient fortress. These moraines dammed rivers and created new lakes, altered drainage patterns that had existed for millions of years, and provided the foundation for ecosystems that would flourish long after the ice retreated. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these glacial architects was their ability to create beauty from destruction. The same forces that ground down mountains and eliminated entire landscapes also created some of the most spectacular scenery on Earth. The fjords of Norway and Alaska, carved by glaciers that flowed to the sea, created waterways of extraordinary depth and beauty. The Great Lakes, scoured out by the advance and retreat of ice sheets, became inland seas that would nurture civilizations yet to come. The glaciers also worked as master gardeners on a continental scale, mixing and redistributing soils across vast areas. They scraped rich sediments from northern regions and spread them across the landscapes to the south,
creating some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet. The thick, black soils of the Middle American Midwest owe their richness in part to this glacial redistribution, a gift from the Ice Age that continues to feed the world today. As you watched these ice sheets work across the millennia, you would have noticed their sensitivity to subtle changes in climate. A slight warming would cause them to retreat, leaving behind the evidence of their former presence in the form of outwash plains and glacial lakes. A return to colder conditions would send them advancing again, bulldozing through forests and grasslands that had reclaimed the temporarily ice-free land. This rhythm of advance and retreat created some of the most complex and beautiful geological formations on Earth. Multiple moraines marked the various stopping points of the glaciers over time, creating a readable history of climate change written in stone and gravel. Drumlins, elongated hills shaped by the flow of ice, pointed like compass needles toward the direction of glacial movement, preserving forever the memory of rivers of ice that no longer exist. The work of these glacial architects was so thorough and comprehensive that even now, thousands of years after the great ice sheets retreated, we live in a world fundamentally shaped by their patient labor. Every major river system in the Northern Hemisphere bears their signature. Every mountain range they touched still shows the marks of their passage. They were sculptors working with tools of ice and time, creating a masterpiece on the scale of continents, leaving behind a transformed world that still bears witness to their awesome, patient power.
As the great ice sheets grew across the northern continents, consuming more and more of the world's water, something extraordinary began to happen to the oceans themselves. The seas that had covered vast areas of the continental shelves for millions of years began to pull back, slowly at first, then more dramatically, exposing lands that had been hidden beneath the waves since the world was young. If you could have stood on what had once been a coastal cliff and watched this transformation unfold, you would have witnessed one of the most remarkable rearrangements of land and sea in Earth's history. The process was so gradual that many generations would have lived and died without noticing the change. But over thousands of years, the retreat became undeniable. Beaches that had been pounded by waves for millennia found themselves stranded high and dry, their shells and sea-smoothed stones now scattered across plains that stretched toward a horizon where the ocean had once met the sky. Rocky tide pools, once refreshed twice daily by incoming waves, became isolated basins that gradually filled with rainwater and then dried entirely under the sun. You would have seen new lands emerging like the slow revelation of a secret. Continental shelves that had been submerged under hundreds of feet of water became rolling plains covered with the sediments of ancient seas. These newly exposed areas were not barren wastelands, but rich, fertile grounds carpeted with the shells of countless marine creatures and thick with nutrients that had accumulated on the ocean floor for millions of years. The most dramatic of these transformations occurred between Asia and North America, where the shallow waters of what we now call the Bering Strait began to drain away entirely. In their place appeared a vast landmass, a bridge of tundra and grassland stretching from Siberia to Alaska. This was Beringia, a country unto itself, hundreds of miles wide and thousands of miles long, with its own rivers, its own weather patterns, and its own communities of plants and animals. Standing on this newly emerged land, you would have found it difficult to imagine that ocean waves had ever lapped at your feet. The ground was solid and permanent feeling, covered with hardy grasses and low shrubs that had quickly colonized the exposed seabed. Rivers cut fresh channels through the landscape,
carrying meltwater from distant glaciers towards seas that now lay much farther away than they had for countless ages. But Beringia was only the most famous of these new lands. Similar bridges appeared in other parts of the world as the oceans continued their retreat. The shallow waters between Britain and continental Europe drained away, creating a broad plain called Doggerland, crisscrossed with rivers and dotted with lakes, where herds of Ice Age animals would roam and early humans would hunt. The islands of Southeast Asia became connected to the mainland, creating vast new territories for both animals and the people who would eventually follow them. Even where no complete land bridges formed, the retreating seas created entirely new coastlines. Continental shelves that had been underwater became coastal plains stretching for hundreds of miles inland from the new shoreline. Rivers that had once emptied directly into the sea now had to carve new, longer paths to reach the much more distant ocean. Estuaries that had been rich mixing zones between fresh and salt water became inland river valleys, completely cut off from marine influence.
The exposure of so much new land had profound effects on the world's weather patterns. Without the moderating influence of large bodies of water, these newly exposed areas experienced more extreme temperatures, both hotter summers and colder winters. The vast continental interiors, now much farther from any ocean, became drier and more prone to dramatic seasonal swings in temperature. You would have witnessed entirely new ecosystems taking shape on these emerged lands. Plants whose seeds had been carried by ocean currents or migrating birds quickly established themselves on the rich sediments of the former seafloor. Animals followed, expanding their ranges across territories that had been completely inaccessible just a few thousand years before. Herds of mammoth and bison began their great migrations across Beringia, following seasonal patterns that would persist for millennia. The new land bridges became highways for life itself. Species that had been isolated on separate continents for millions of years suddenly found pathways to new territories. Plants and animals flowed both directions across these bridges, mixing populations that had diverged long ago and creating new communities of life that had never existed before. For the early humans, who were just beginning to spread across the world, these land bridges were pathways to entirely new worlds. Small bands of hunters, following the herds they depended on for survival, found themselves walking across what had once been the bottom of the sea, stepping into continents that no human foot had ever touched. They carried with them the knowledge and skills they had developed in their Ice Age homeland, adapting them to new environments and new challenges. The rivers that flowed across these exposed lands were different from any rivers that exist today. Fed by the melting edges of nearby glaciers, they carried enormous loads of sediment and nutrients. Some were braided waterways that split and rejoined across wide valleys, while others cut deep channels through the soft sediments of the former ocean floor. Fish populations that had been confined to coastal areas suddenly had access to vast new river systems, spreading into territories that offered both new opportunities and new challenges. As you looked out across these transformed landscapes, you would have witnessed a world in the midst of profound change. The familiar boundaries between land and sea had been redrawn. Ancient migration routes had been severed, while entirely new ones had opened up. The very maps of the world, if such things had existed, would have needed to be completely redrawn to account for the new reality of a planet where much less of the surface was covered by water. But this transformation was not permanent. The same forces that had locked away the ocean's water and ice were already beginning to change. The world was not static, but dynamic. and the seas that had retreated would one day return, reclaiming their ancient territories and once again dividing the continents. The land bridges that seemed so solid and permanent were, in geological terms, merely temporary pathways across a world in flux.
Across the heart of the Ice Age world, stretching from Western Europe through Siberia and into the heart of North America, lay a landscape unlike anything that exists on Earth today. These were the Mammoth Steppes, vast grasslands that rolled from horizon to horizon under skies so wide they seemed to dwarf the very curvature of the planet. If you could have stood in the middle of this enormous plain, you would have found yourself in what may have been the richest ecosystem our planet has ever known. A cold prairie that supported some of the greatest gatherings of large animals in Earth's history. The steppes themselves were deceptively simple in appearance. No towering forests broke the endless view. No mountain ranges interrupted the flow of wind across the grass. Instead, there was a subtle complexity in the low vegetation that carpeted this vast world. Hardy grasses dominated, species perfectly adapted to the short, intense growing seasons and the long, bitter winters. These were not the lush grasses of temperate meadows, but tough, fibrous plants that could survive being buried under snow for 8 months of the year and then explode into growth during the brief summer warmth. Mixed among the grasses were herbs and flowering plants that added their own character to the steppes. Arctic poppies bloomed in brilliant yellow patches during the short summer, while cushions of moss campion created soft mounds of pink flowers that seemed almost impossibly delicate in this harsh environment. Willow trees grew here too, but not as the tall specimens we know today. These were dwarf willows, barely knee-high, their branches spreading horizontally across the ground to avoid the constant wind that swept across the open landscape. The soil beneath this vegetation was rich beyond modern imagination, fed by constant deposits of wind-blown dust and organic matter from the countless animals that lived and died on the steppes. This was loess soil, fine particles ground from rocks by distant glaciers and carried hundreds of miles by the relentless winds. It created a growing medium so fertile that it could support the enormous biomass of animals that made the Mammoth Steppes their home. You would have heard the steppes long before you could see their inhabitants clearly. The sound would have carried for miles across the flat landscape, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, punctuated by higher calls and the rhythmic thunder of countless hoofbeats. This was the music of the great herds, a symphony of life played out on a scale that modern ecosystems can barely hint at. The woolly mammoths were the undisputed giants of this world, and seeing them in their natural environment would have been one of the most awe-inspiring sights in natural history. These were not the solitary zoo elephants we might imagine, but members of complex social groups that moved across the steppes in family units led by wise matriarchs who remembered the locations of the best grazing areas and the safest river crossings. Their thick, reddish-brown coats rippled in the wind like living carpets, and their curved tusks, some reaching lengths of 15 feet, swept the snow aside as they searched for the nutritious grasses beneath. A mammoth family group might number dozens of individuals, from tiny calves staying close to their mother's sides to massive bulls whose tusks had grown so long they nearly met in front of their faces. You would have watched them communicate with rumbling calls so deep they were felt as much as heard, vibrations that traveled through the ground to reach other family groups miles away. Their intelligence was evident in everything they did, from the way they cared for their young to their sophisticated use of their trunks to manipulate their environment. Sharing the steppes with the mammoths were the woolly rhinoceroses, creatures almost as large but built for a different kind of life. Where mammoths were social and communicative, the rhinos were more solitary, their thick hides covered with long, shaggy hair that made them look like walking mountains of fur. Their most striking feature was their enormous nasal horn, which could grow to be 6 feet long, used both for defense and for sweeping snow away from the vegetation they needed to survive.
The steppes thundered with the hoofbeats of vast bison herds, but these were not the plains bison we know from North America's more recent history. These steppe bison were giants, standing taller at the shoulder than a person, with horns that could span 8 feet from tip to tip. They moved in herds that stretched from one horizon to the other, their thick winter coats making them appear even more massive than they actually were. Following ancient migration routes, they would surge across the steppes in seasonal movements that had been established for thousands of years. Wild horses added their own character to this community, but these were not the elegant animals of later ages. Steppe horses were stocky and robust, with thick coats and sturdy legs adapted for long journeys across broken ground. They lived in tight family bands led by dominant stallions, and their neighing calls would ring across the grasslands as they communicated with other groups scattered across the vast landscape. Among all these herbivores moved the predators that depended on them for survival. Packs of dire wolves, larger and more powerful than any wolf alive today, followed the herds at a respectful distance, watching for signs of weakness or opportunity. These wolves had learned to work together in coordinated groups, using sophisticated hunting strategies to bring down prey many times their individual size. Their howls would echo across the steppes on cold nights, a sound that spoke of wild intelligence and patient hunger. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, were the apex predators of this world. Unlike their descendants in warmer climates, these lions had developed thick winter coats and had learned to hunt in the challenging conditions of the steppes. They moved in family groups, using the tall grasses as cover, despite the generally open nature of the landscape, approaching their prey with the patient stealth that only the most successful predators possess. The smaller inhabitants of the steppes were no less important to the ecosystem's functioning. Ground squirrels and lemmings created vast underground cities beneath the grassland, their burrow systems providing shelter for countless other small creatures. Arctic foxes darted through the grass, changing their coats from brown to pure white with the seasons, hunting the rodents and scavenging from the kills of larger predators. Even the skies above the steppes were rich with life. Ravens and rough-legged hawks rode the constant winds, their sharp eyes scanning the grasslands below for carrion and prey. During the brief summer months, countless smaller birds would arrive to take advantage of the explosion of insect life, filling the air with songs that provided a counterpoint to the deeper voices of the large mammals below. The seasonal rhythm of the mammoth steppes was unlike anything in the modern world. Winter brought a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever, with temperatures so cold that the very air seemed to crystallize. The large animals would gather in sheltered valleys or move to areas where the wind had blown the snow away from the grass. Summer, when it finally came, was a time of frantic activity. The brief growing season meant that animals had only a few months to build up the fat reserves they would need to survive another winter. Standing in the middle of this vast grassland, you would have felt both the immensity of the natural world and your own small place within it. The horizon stretched unbroken in every direction, marked only by the slowly moving shapes of great herds and the occasional distant predator. The wind carried the sounds and scents of a living world on a scale that seems almost mythical to us now, a reminder of what Earth was capable of supporting when conditions were right and the balance of life was perfectly maintained. This was the Mammoth Steppes, a world of giants moving across an endless stage where survival depended on understanding the rhythms of cold and warmth, migration and return, and where the patient forces of evolution had created one of the most magnificent communities of life that our planet has ever known.
In this frozen world, size mattered in ways that modern ecosystems can barely hint at. The Ice Age was truly an age of giants, where creatures of extraordinary dimensions roamed landscapes that seemed designed to accommodate their massive forms. These were not simply larger versions of animals we know today, but evolutionary masterpieces, each species perfectly adapted to thrive in conditions that would challenge any living thing. To encounter one of these magnificent beings in their natural habitat would have been to witness evolution's most ambitious experiments with scale and survival. The woolly mammoth, though we have mentioned them before, deserves a closer look, for they were perhaps the most successful of all Ice Age giants. Standing up to 11 feet tall at the shoulder, with tusks that could weigh as much as a small tree, they were living monuments to the power of adaptation. But it was not their size alone that made them remarkable. Their thick, double-layered coat of hair could keep them warm in temperatures that would kill most modern mammals within hours. The outer layer consisted of long guard hairs that could reach nearly 3 feet in length, while underneath lay a dense undercoat of wool that trapped warm air close to their skin. You would have been struck by their intelligence as much as their size. Mammoth families displayed complex social behaviors, mourning their dead, caring for injured members, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next through low-frequency calls that could travel from miles across the steppes. Moving through the same landscapes were the woolly rhinoceroses, creatures that seemed built more for endurance than elegance. These massive herbivores, covered in thick, shaggy coats of brown and gray hair, possessed an almost mythical appearance. Their most striking feature was their horn, not made of bone like a deer's antlers, but of compressed hair that had grown into a solid, sharp point. The largest of these horns could reach 6 feet in length, a formidable weapon for defense, and a practical tool for sweeping snow away from buried vegetation. Unlike their modern relatives in Africa and Asia, woolly rhinoceroses were solitary creatures, each adult claiming a territory that they would defend against intruders. You might have encountered one standing motionless in a snowy field, seemingly asleep, until some slight movement or sound would cause them to lift their massive head and fix you with small, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The predators of this world were no less impressive than the herbivores they hunted. Saber-toothed cats with their distinctive elongated canine teeth were perhaps the most fearsome hunters of the Ice Age. These were not the small, quick cats of later eras, but powerful, bear-like predators with shoulders and necks built for delivering devastating killing bites. Their famous sabers could reach 7 inches in length and were sharper than any knife, designed to slice through the thick hide and dense muscle of their massive prey. But the most magnificent of all Ice Age predators were the cave lions. These enormous cats were nearly twice the size of modern lions, with males weighing as much as 800 pounds. They had adapted to the cold with thick winter coats and had learned to hunt in cooperative groups, much like their modern relatives, but their prey was on an entirely different scale. A pride of cave lions could bring down a full-grown mammoth, working together with a coordination and intelligence that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. In the forests and woodlands that bordered the Great Steppes lived another kind of giant altogether. The giant ground sloths of the Americas were creatures that seemed to belong in a fairy tale rather than the real world. Some species reached the size of small elephants with massive claws that they used not for hunting, but for stripping leaves from trees and digging in the earth for roots and tubers. Despite their fearsome appearance, these were gentle giants, slow-moving herbivores that posed no threat to anything except the vegetation they consumed in enormous quantities. You would have found their behavior almost comically deliberate. Where other Ice Age animals moved with purpose and urgency, the giant sloths seemed to exist in their own slower time frame, each movement carefully considered, each step placed with ponderous precision. Yet this apparent laziness was actually a sophisticated energy conservation strategy, allowing them to survive on relatively poor quality food in environments where every calorie mattered. The short-faced bear represented the ultimate in Ice Age predation. Standing on its hind legs, this massive carnivore could reach heights of 12 feet with long legs that allowed it to run at surprising speeds across open ground. Unlike the brown and black bears we know today, short-faced bears were primarily meat eaters, using their size and speed to dominate the carcasses left by other predators or to hunt prey directly when the opportunity arose. Even the wolves of the Ice Age dwarfed their modern descendants. Dire wolves were not only larger than contemporary wolves, but more heavily built with massive heads and jaws designed to crush bone. They hunted in packs that could number in the dozens, bringing down prey through sheer persistence and coordinated attack. Their howls would echo across the frozen landscape on cold nights, a sound that spoke of wild intelligence and patient hunger. The Irish elk, despite its name, was actually a giant deer that lived across Europe and Asia. The males carried antlers that could span 12 feet from tip to tip and weigh as much as 90 pounds. These enormous antlers were used in spectacular dominance displays during mating season, when rival males would clash in contests that could be heard from miles across the steppes. The energy required to grow and carry such massive ornaments meant that only the healthiest and most successful males could compete for mates. In the caves and rock shelters that dotted the Ice Age landscape lived the cave bears, massive omnivores that could weigh as much as 1,500 pounds. Unlike their modern relatives, cave bears were primarily plant eaters, using their enormous size and strength to access food sources that other animals could not reach. They would hibernate through the long Ice Age winters in deep caves, sometimes in groups numbering in the hundreds. What made all of these giants possible was the incredible productivity of Ice Age ecosystems. The Mammoth steppes could support biomass densities that seem almost impossible by modern standards. The combination of rich soils, seasonal abundance, and vast open ranges created conditions where large animals could not only survive, but thrive in numbers that stagger the imagination. Yet for all their size and apparent dominance, these giants lived within ecosystems of extraordinary complexity and balance. Each species had evolved to fill a specific niche, and their interactions created a web of relationships that maintained the stability of the entire system. The mammoths' grazing patterns influenced plant communities across vast areas. The predation pressure from cave lions and saber-toothed cats kept herbivore populations healthy and mobile. Even the giant ground sloths, with their seemingly passive lifestyle, played crucial roles as seed dispersers and landscape engineers. to have walked among these giants would have been to experience nature on a scale that modern humans can only imagine. The ground would have shaken with their footsteps. The air would have been filled with their calls and the sounds of their movement, and the landscape itself would have been shaped by their presence in ways both subtle and profound.
Among all the creatures that called the Ice Age world home, none were more remarkable for their adaptability than the small bands of early humans who learned to thrive in conditions that would challenge the hardiest of modern survivors. These were not the numerous, technologically advanced societies we know today, but scattered groups of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, each band representing years of accumulated knowledge about survival in a world where a single mistake could mean death for an entire family. If you could have approached one of their camps on a winter evening, you would have first noticed the glow of fire cutting through the endless twilight of the Ice Age world. Fire was the centerpiece of human survival, not merely a source of warmth, but the foundation of everything that made life possible in the frozen landscape. Around these carefully tended flames, entire communities gathered, their faces illuminated by the dancing light, their bodies wrapped in layers of carefully crafted furs that represented months of patient work. The clothing of Ice Age peoples was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Every piece was designed for survival in temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees or lower. They had learned to layer different types of fur and hide, creating insulation systems that modern outdoor gear can barely match. The outer layer might be made from the thick hide of a mammoth or bison, waterproof and wind-resistant. Beneath this, they wore garments crafted from softer furs, fox or rabbit perhaps, that trapped warm air close to the skin. Their boots were particularly ingenious, often constructed with multiple layers, including grass padding for additional insulation and moisture absorption. The soles were made from thick hide and sometimes fitted with pieces of bone or antler to provide traction on icy surfaces. Even their mittens were carefully designed, with separate compartments for fingers when fine motor control was needed, but able to keep hands together for maximum warmth when detailed work wasn't required. You would have been struck with the sophistication of their shelters. In regions where wood was scarce, they had learned to construct homes using the very bones of the animals they hunted. Mammoth ribs formed the framework of these dwellings, curved like the supports of a great tent, while smaller bones were used to anchor hides that formed the walls. These bone houses were partially dug into the ground for additional insulation, with entrance tunnels that helped keep warm air inside and cold air out. The interiors of these shelters were carefully organized spaces where every square foot served a specific purpose. Sleeping areas were raised off the ground and lined with thick furs. Tool-making areas were positioned near the fire for light and warmth. Storage spaces held carefully preserved food, extra clothing, and the raw materials needed for tool production. Despite the harsh conditions outside, these homes could maintain temperatures comfortable enough for families to work, eat, and raise children. Toolmaking was an art form elevated to the level of survival necessity. Using techniques passed down through countless generations, Ice Age craftsmen could transform a simple piece of flint into a razor-sharp blade, a perfectly balanced spear point, or a delicate needle for sewing. They understood the properties of different stones, knowing which types would hold an edge longest, which could be shaped most easily, and which were best suited for different kinds of tools.
But stone was not their only material. Bone and antler provided the raw materials for spear throwers that could multiply the force of a human arm, for fish hooks that could catch protein from ice-cold streams, and for the needles that made their sophisticated clothing possible. Even the sinews of animals were carefully preserved and used as strong, flexible thread for binding tool parts together or sewing clothing that would not come apart under stress. Hunting in the Ice Age required not just individual skill, but sophisticated group coordination. To bring down a mammoth or woolly rhinoceros, hunters had to work together with precision that came only from years of practice and intimate knowledge of their prey's behavior. They studied the animals they hunted, learning their migration patterns, their preferred grazing areas, and their reactions to different weather conditions. Some hunting techniques involved driving animals into prepared ambush sites, perhaps a narrow valley where spear-armed hunters could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Others relied on persistence hunting, following herds for days or weeks until the opportunity for a successful attack presented itself. The largest hunts were community events, with every member of the band playing a role, from the scouts who tracked the animals to the children who helped process the meat and hides afterward. The social structure of these Ice Age communities was built around sharing and cooperation. In a world where resources were often scarce and unpredictable, the survival of each individual depended on the success of the group as a whole. Food was shared according to complex social rules that ensured no one went hungry when hunting was successful, but also that hunters were motivated to take the risks necessary to provide for everyone. Knowledge was perhaps the most precious resource of all. The location of seasonal water sources, the behavior patterns of different prey species, the properties of various plants, and their uses for food or medicine. All of this information had to be memorized and passed down through oral tradition. The elders of each band were living libraries, their memories containing survival information accumulated over lifetimes of experience in the Ice Age world. Children in these communities began learning survival skills almost as soon as they could walk. They watched the adults around them constantly, absorbing lessons about fire making, tool crafting, animal behavior, and the countless other pieces of knowledge they would need to survive. Play was practice, with children using miniature tools to learn the motions they would need to master as adults. The Ice Age peoples also developed sophisticated systems for dealing with the psychological challenges of their harsh environment. Storytelling around the fire served not just as entertainment, but as a way of preserving important information and maintaining group cohesion during the long, dark winters. Art, whether painted on cave walls or carved into bone and antler, provided a form of expression that helped people process the intense experiences of their daily lives. Their spiritual beliefs often centered around the animals they hunted and the forces of nature that shaped their world. Cave paintings suggest deep respect for the creatures that provided their sustenance, while burial practices indicate belief systems that helped communities cope with the loss of members to the harsh conditions they faced every day. Despite the constant challenges, these Ice Age peoples were not merely surviving, but developing the foundations of human culture. They were creating the first complex tools, the first art, the first organized hunting strategies, and the first social systems that would eventually evolve into the civilizations we know today. In their small fires burning against the vast darkness of the Ice Age world, they were kindling something that would eventually transform the planet itself.
The tools and technologies that Ice Age peoples developed were far more sophisticated than we might imagine. These were not crude implements hastily fashioned for immediate use, but carefully designed instruments that represented thousands of years of refinement and innovation. Each tool was a perfect marriage of form and function, crafted from materials that had to be gathered, processed, and shaped using nothing but other tools and patient skill. Stone tool technology had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication by the height of the Ice Age. If you could have watched a master craftsman at work, you would have seen someone who understood stone almost as intimately as a modern sculptor understands clay. They could read the grain and structure of different rock types, predict exactly how a piece of flint would fracture when struck at a particular angle, and shape that fracture to create tools with edges sharper than modern surgical steel. The process began with the careful selection of raw materials. Not every piece of stone would do. The craftsman would examine potential tool stone for flaws, testing its quality with small experimental strikes. The best pieces were often carried for miles from their source, precious resources that would be worked and reworked until every useful flake had been removed. Different tools required different techniques. For creating large cutting implements, the toolmaker might use a technique called pressure flaking, using a pointed bone or antler tool to carefully remove tiny chips of stone, slowly shaping the edge to exactly the desired form. For spear points, the process was even more demanding, requiring the creation of a perfectly symmetrical point that would fly straight and penetrate deeply. But stone was only one element in their technological toolkit. Bone and antler provided materials with properties that stone could not match. These organic materials were tough but flexible, allowing the creation of tools that could bend without breaking. Mammoth ribs became the frameworks for shelters. Reindeer antler was carved into spear throwers, ingenious devices that effectively extended the length of a hunter's arm, allowing spears to be thrown with much greater force and accuracy. The creation of composite tools marked one of the greatest innovations of Ice Age technology. These were implements that combined multiple materials to create something more effective than any single material could provide. A spear might have a stone point for penetration, a wooden shaft for strength and length, and sinew wrapping to hold everything together securely. The hafting of these tools required sophisticated knowledge of adhesives, often created from tree saps and animal blood that could hold firm even in extreme cold.
Fire technology had evolved far beyond simple flame making. Ice Age peoples had learned to control fire with precision that seems almost miraculous. They knew which types of wood produced the least smoke for cooking inside their shelters, which materials created the hottest flames for working stone, and which fuels would burn longest through the cold nights. They had developed methods for carrying fire over long distances, using specially prepared tinders that could smolder for hours without bursting into flame. Food preservation had become a sophisticated science. In a world where hunting success was unpredictable and seasonal abundance had to sustain communities through long, lean winters, the ability to store food safely was often the difference between life and death. They had learned to smoke meat using specific combinations of woods that not only preserved the protein, but added flavors that made monotonous winter diets more palatable. Permafrost became natural freezers where large quantities of meat could be stored for months. They had also developed techniques for rendering fat from animals, creating concentrated energy sources that could be stored in specially prepared containers made from animal stomachs or inflated bladders. These fats were not just food, but also fuel for lamps that provided light during the endless dark of Ice Age winters, and waterproofing for clothing and shelters.
Transportation technology showed remarkable adaptation to Ice Age conditions. In regions where snow persisted for most of the year, they had invented early forms of snowshoes, woven frames that distributed weight and allowed travel across soft snow that would otherwise be impassable. They had learned to construct simple sleds for moving heavy loads using the runners made from bone or specially shaped wood that could glide efficiently over snow and ice. The development of clothing technology represented perhaps their greatest achievement in terms of daily survival. Every garment was a complex engineering project, designed to provide maximum insulation while allowing the flexibility needed for hunting and gathering. They had learned to work with different types of fur and hide, understanding which materials were best for different parts of garments and different environmental conditions. The sewing technology required to create these garments was remarkably advanced. Using needles carved from bird bones or fish bones, they could create seams that were virtually waterproof, essential in a world where getting wet could be fatal. They had developed techniques for softening hides that involved chewing, specialized tools, and various chemical treatments using materials like animal brains and certain plant extracts. Navigation across the featureless landscapes of the Ice Age steppes required its own set of technologies and techniques. Without landmarks in the traditional sense, they had learned to read subtle signs in the environment, the patterns of wind-blown snow, the behavior of animals, the position of stars during different seasons. They could find their way across vast distances using knowledge that was part science, part art, and completely essential for survival. All of these technologies were embedded in complex social systems of learning and knowledge transfer. Master craftsmen took apprentices who learned through years of observation and practice. Techniques were refined over generations, with each innovation carefully tested and either adopted or discarded based on its practical value in the harsh reality of Ice Age life.
In the Ice Age world, humans were not the dominant species they would later become. They were prey as much as predators, sharing the frozen landscape with hunters whose size, strength, and specialized killing abilities placed them among the most formidable predators Earth has ever known. To venture beyond the protective circle of a campfire was to enter a realm where death could come silently from the shadows, or with the thunderous charge of a creature built for nothing but efficient killing. The saber-toothed cats were perhaps the most terrifying of all Ice Age predators, not because of their size alone, but because of their perfect adaptation to ambush hunting. If you had encountered one in the wild, you might never have seen it coming. These cats had learned to use the broken terrain of the Ice Age landscape to their advantage, hiding behind boulders left by retreating glaciers, or crouching motionless in tall grass until their prey wandered within striking distance. Their famous sabers were not just for show, but precision instruments of death. Unlike modern cats that kill by suffocating their prey, saber-toothed cats used their elongated canines to deliver deep, slashing wounds that severed major blood vessels and caused rapid death through blood loss. Their powerful shoulder and neck muscles were specifically adapted to drive these weapons home with devastating force, while their relatively weak bite force meant they had to rely entirely on the precision of their attack. You would have known one was in the area by the eerie silence that fell over the landscape when these predators were hunting.
Even the ever-present background sounds of small animals moving through grass and brush would cease, as every creature instinctively understood that death was stalking through their world. The saber-toothed cat's approach was so quiet that often the first sign of its presence was the soft whisper of grass parting around its massive body. Cave lions presented a different kind of terror entirely. These enormous cats, nearly twice the size of modern lions, had retained the social hunting behaviors of their smaller descendants, but applied them to prey on a scale that seems almost impossible. A pride of cave lions working together could bring down a full-grown mammoth, using coordinated tactics that demonstrated intelligence and planning abilities that rivaled those of early humans. Their hunting strategy often involved days of patient stalking, following herds and waiting for the right moment when a young, old, or injured animal became separated from the group. When they finally attacked, it was with the combined strength of multiple hunters working in perfect coordination. The sound of such an attack, the roars of the lions mixed with the trumpeting screams of their massive prey, would echo across the steppes for miles, a reminder to every living thing of the violent realities of survival in the Ice Age world. The dire wolves represented yet another form of predatory perfection. These were not simply larger versions of modern wolves, but specialized hunters with bone-crushing jaws and the endurance to pursue prey across vast distances. A pack of dire wolves on the hunt was a force of nature, capable of running down even the swiftest Ice Age herbivores through sheer persistence and tactical intelligence.
You would have heard them long before seeing them, their howls carrying across the frozen landscape in complex harmonies that coordinated pack movements over distances of many miles. Each howl contained information about the location of prey, the position of pack members, and the strategy being employed in the hunt. To human listeners huddled around their fires, these sounds represented one of the most immediate threats to their survival. The short-faced bear was perhaps the most terrifying predator of all, not because it hunted in packs or relied on stealth, but because it was simply too large and powerful for any defense to be completely effective. Standing 12 feet tall on its hind legs, with long limbs that allowed it to run at surprising speeds, this massive carnivore dominated every environment it entered. Unlike modern bears, which are largely omnivorous, the short-faced bear was primarily a meat eater, using its size and speed to claim the kills of other predators or to hunt directly when the opportunity presented itself. The approach of one of these giants would have been felt as much as seen, their footsteps causing vibrations that traveled through the frozen ground for considerable distances. Even the smaller predators of the Ice Age world presented constant dangers to human survival. Wolverines, though much smaller than the great cats and bears, were perhaps pound for pound the most ferocious predators of all. These compact, muscular carnivores were capable of driving away predators many times their size from fresh kills, using their incredible strength and utterly fearless temperament to claim resources that they could never have obtained through hunting alone. For early humans, living with these predators required constant vigilance and sophisticated defensive strategies. Fire was their most reliable protection, as most Ice Age predators had an instinctive fear of flames that could be exploited to create safe zones around human camps. The flickering light of campfires served not just as warmth and illumination, but as a boundary marker that most predators would not cross. Human settlements were carefully positioned to take advantage of natural defensive features.
Caves provided protection on multiple sides, while camps in open areas were often placed on slight elevations that allowed sentries to watch for approaching threats. The construction of shelters took predator behavior into account, with entrance tunnels designed to be too small for large carnivores but easily defended by humans with spears. Group sleeping arrangements reflected the constant threat of night attacks. Humans slept in tight clusters, with guards taking turns staying awake through the dark hours. Children and elderly members of the group were positioned in the center of these arrangements, while the strongest hunters slept on the perimeter with weapons within easy reach. The psychological pressure of living under constant threat of predation shaped Ice Age human behavior in profound ways. Travel between camps was undertaken only in groups and only during daylight hours when visibility allowed for early detection of threats. Hunting parties moved with scouts, ranging ahead and behind, constantly watching for signs of predators that might be following the same prey animals. Yet, despite the dangers, these early humans learned to coexist with the great predators of their world. They studied predator behavior with scientific precision, learning to read the signs that indicated when dangerous animals were in the area and developing strategies for avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible. Sometimes they even learned to benefit from predator activity, following at a safe distance to scavenge from kills when the original hunters had finished feeding. This constant dance between predator and prey, hunter and hunted, shaped the evolution of human intelligence and social organization in ways that continue to influence our behavior today. The cooperation, vigilance, and strategic thinking required to survive in a world of Ice Age predators laid the foundation for all the complex societies that would follow.
The Ice Age was not a single, unchanging freeze, but a world that breathed with cycles so vast that they dwarfed human understanding. If you could have lived through multiple generations in that ancient world, you might have noticed subtle shifts, winters that seemed to last a little longer, summers that felt slightly cooler, or perhaps springs that arrived later than the elders remembered. These were not random fluctuations, but part of a grand celestial dance driven by the slow wobble and tilt of Earth itself as it orbited the Sun. The planet's relationship with its star was never quite stable. Earth's orbit stretched and contracted over periods of roughly 100,000 years, sometimes bringing the planet closer to the Sun, sometimes carrying it farther away. The angle of Earth's tilt shifted across spans of 41,000 years, determining how much solar energy reached the northern and southern hemispheres during different seasons. Even the planet's axis wobbled like a spinning top slowing down, completing this cycle approximately every 23,000 years, and changing which season occurred when Earth was closest to the Sun. These astronomical cycles, later named Milankovitch cycles, after the mathematician who calculated their patterns, created a complex rhythm of warming and cooling that governed the advance and retreat of ice sheets across vast stretches of time. When the cycles aligned to reduce summer sunshine in northern regions, snow and ice accumulated year after year, building the great glaciers that would eventually cover continents. When the cycles shifted to increase solar energy, the ice would begin its slow retreat, sometimes taking thousands of years to fully withdraw from lands that it had occupied for tens of millennia. You would have witnessed these changes not as dramatic events, but as gradual shifts in the world around you. During the coldest phases, the great ice sheets pressed farther south, their edges advancing like slow-motion tidal waves of frozen water. The Mammoth steppes expanded, providing new territories for the great herds to roam, while forests retreated toward warmer refuges in protected valleys in southern regions.
Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the world would begin to warm. The edges of glaciers would start to produce more meltwater during the brief summers. Rivers that had been frozen for most of the year would flow more freely. The advancing tree line would creep northward, reclaiming territory that had been locked in ice for thousands of years. These interglacial periods, as scientists now call them, were times of dramatic transformation when the Ice Age world temporarily resembled something closer to our modern climate. During these warmer interludes, you might have seen forests return to regions that had been tundra for countless generations. Rivers swollen with glacial meltwater would carve new channels and create temporary lakes that lasted for centuries before draining away. Animals that had been restricted to southern refuges would expand their ranges northward following the retreating ice and colonizing newly available territories. But these warm periods were temporary interruptions in the Ice Age's longer rhythm. Eventually, the astronomical cycles would shift once again. Summer sunshine would weaken in crucial northern regions, and the cold would begin its patient return. Forests would die back, replaced by grasslands and then by tundra. The great ice sheets would start their advance again, bulldozing through landscapes that had briefly known warmth, erasing the temporary ecosystems that had flourished during the interglacial respite.
For the life forms that inhabited this rhythmically changing world, survival required extraordinary flexibility. Species had to be capable of major range shifts, able to retreat southward when the ice advanced and expand northward when it retreated. Some animals developed the ability to hibernate through extended periods of harsh conditions, while others maintained populations in refugia, small pockets of suitable habitat that persisted even during the most severe cold phases. Human populations faced these same challenges but met them with characteristic adaptability. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated long-term climatic shifts, changes in vegetation patterns, alterations in animal behavior, modifications in seasonal timing. When conditions began to deteriorate, they would gradually shift their territories, following the resources they depended on for survival. The mammoths and other megafauna showed remarkable resilience to these cycles, their populations expanding and contracting with the available habitat, but persisting through multiple glacial, interglacial transitions. Their success lay partly in their mobility and partly in their generalized feeding habits, which allowed them to take advantage of whatever vegetation was available in their changing world. These natural climate cycles also created opportunities for evolutionary change. During glacial maxima, when species were restricted to small refugia, populations could diverge and developed new characteristics. When conditions improved and ranges expanded again, these newly differentiated populations would sometimes meet and interbreed, creating increased genetic diversity that enhanced their ability to survive future environmental challenges. The evidence of these great cycles is preserved in ice cores drilled from the hearts of ancient glaciers, in ocean sediments that recorded changing temperatures, and in pollen deposits that show how vegetation communities shifted back and forth across the landscape. Each layer tells part of the story of a world that never quite settled into stability, always changing, always challenging life to adapt or perish. Understanding these rhythms helps explain why the Ice Age world was simultaneously harsh and productive,
why it could support such enormous populations of large animals, while also driving many species to extinction. It was a world of constant change, but change that followed predictable patterns that life, given enough time, could learn to navigate and exploit.
The atmosphere of the Ice Age was fundamentally different from the air we breathe today. If you could have taken a deep breath of that ancient air, you would have tasted something thinner, drier, and charged with the mineral essence of a world being constantly ground and redistributed by forces of extraordinary scale. The very composition of the atmosphere had changed, with carbon dioxide levels nearly half of what they are in our modern world, creating conditions that were not only colder, but profoundly different in character. Above the great ice sheets, massive high-pressure systems dominated weather patterns across entire continents. These atmospheric giants created their own wind systems, drawing cold, dry air down from the glacial surfaces and sending it racing across the landscape in powerful streams that could persist for days or weeks at a time. Standing in the path of one of these katabatic winds, you would have felt the bite of air that had been chilled to its very core by contact with ice that might have been frozen for thousands of years. The temperature differences between the ice-covered regions and the areas farther south created pressure gradients that drove winds with an intensity rarely seen in our modern world. These were not the gentle breezes of a temperate climate, but forces capable of moving massive amounts of material across vast distances. The sound of these winds was a constant presence in the Ice Age world, a low moaning or howling that spoke of the planet's restless energy being expressed through the movement of air masses on a continental scale. Perhaps nowhere was the power of Ice Age winds more dramatically demonstrated than in their ability to lift and transport dust. The grinding action of glaciers had created enormous quantities of fine rock flour, pulverized stone so fine it could hang suspended in the atmosphere for weeks at a time. When powerful wind systems encountered these deposits, they could lift millions of tons of material into the air, creating dust storms that darkened skies across entire regions. You would have seen these storms approaching from far away, great walls of brown and gray dust that seemed to merge earth and sky into a single, churning mass. The leading edge of such a storm would bring a distinctive change in the light, filtering the sun through countless suspended particles until the world took on an otherworldly, sepia tone. When the storm finally arrived, it would bring with it the fine grit of distant mountains, depositing layers of mineral-rich dust that would eventually become some of the most fertile soils on Earth.
These dust deposits, called loess by modern geologists, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years into layers that could reach hundreds of feet in thickness. The process was so gradual that it would have been nearly invisible to Ice Age inhabitants, yet so persistent that it fundamentally changed the character of vast regions. The rich agricultural soils of northern China, the American Midwest, and parts of Europe all owe their fertility to this patient work of Ice Age winds, carrying nutrients from one part of the world and carefully depositing them in another. The absence of extensive forests in many regions meant that these winds encountered little resistance as they swept across the landscape. Where modern air masses are slowed and broken up by tree cover, Ice Age winds could maintain their strength and direction for thousands of miles, creating more extreme and persistent weather patterns than anything we experience today.
During the brief summer months when the ice sheets experienced some melting, the contrast between cold ice and warmer surrounding areas became even more pronounced. This created powerful convection currents that could generate sudden, intense storms. You might have witnessed the dramatic sight of thunderheads building rapidly over the edges of glaciers, their towering clouds lit by lightning that seemed to bridge the gap between the frozen earth and the sky above. The clarity of Ice Age skies, when they were not filled with dust, was probably extraordinary by modern standards. The dry, thin atmosphere and the absence of industrial pollution would have made the stars appear closer and brighter than they do today. Aurora displays, driven by the same solar activity that creates them now, would have been visible much farther south due to changes in Earth's magnetic field during this period, painting the polar skies with curtains of green and blue light that reflected off the endless expanses of ice below. Winter in the Ice Age world brought periods of almost supernatural stillness, when high-pressure systems would settle over vast regions and the winds would simply stop. During these quiet interludes, the only sounds might be the distant crack of shifting ice or the soft whisper of snow settling. The silence could be so complete that it felt almost solid, a presence in itself that reminded every living creature of the vastness of the frozen world around them. Even the seasonal patterns of wind and weather were different, with longer winters and shorter, more intense summers creating atmospheric rhythms that had no parallel in our modern experience. These patterns shaped not only the physical landscape, but the behavior of every creature that lived within them, from the migration timing of great herds to the flowering patterns of the few plants tough enough to survive in this wind-scoured world.
The first signs appeared at the margins where ice met the world beyond. Glaciers that had advanced for millennia began to pause their relentless march southward. The balance between accumulation and melting started to tip almost imperceptibly toward warmth. Summers grew slightly longer. Winters no longer quite matched their predecessors' intensity. If you had stood at the edge of one of the great ice sheets during these early stages of retreat, you would have witnessed the birth of rivers unlike any that exist today. Meltwater, freed from its frozen prison after thousands of years, began to flow in increasing quantities. These were not gentle streams, but torrents charged with liberation energy, carrying the ground-up remains of mountains and stories of landscapes long buried under ice. As centuries passed and warming continued, these streams merged into rivers of unprecedented power, fed by melting ice sheets containing more water than all of today's rivers combined. These torrents carved through landscapes with continent reshaping force. You would have seen valleys deepened in decades that had taken millions of years to form. One dramatic consequence was the formation of vast temporary lakes at the ice margins. As glaciers withdrew, they left behind walls of rock and debris that dammed valleys. Meltwater collected behind these barriers, creating bodies of water larger than modern seas. When these barriers finally failed, entire lakes would drain in days, sending megafloods racing across the landscape with such force they carried house-sized boulders for hundreds of miles. The warming climate brought changes immediately apparent to Ice Age inhabitants. As temperatures rose, vegetation began colonizing areas locked under ice for thousands of years. Pioneer species like birch and willow established themselves on raw ground left by retreating glaciers,
beginning the slow process of creating soil from rock dust. Following the plants came animals. Herds confined to narrow corridors suddenly found vast new territories opening before them. The great migrations shifted and expanded as species tracked changing food and shelter availability. For humans, this period brought both opportunity and challenge. Retreating ice sheets exposed new hunting grounds, while warming climate made survival less desperate. But change also brought uncertainty. Traditional territories might flood or transform within a single generation. The great ice sheets began to fragment as warming continued. Instead of continuous walls across continents, glaciers broke into smaller, isolated remnants. These fragments were less stable, more vulnerable to rapid changes, and prone to sudden advances or retreats. Sea levels began their slow but inexorable rise. Coastal plains exposed when ocean water was locked in ice started disappearing beneath returning waves. The great land bridges connecting continents began to shrink and eventually vanish. This was not the end of the Ice Age, but the beginning of its end. The great melt would continue for thousands of years more, maintaining its trajectory toward the warmer world we know today.
As the Great Melt continued and the Ice Age world began its slow transformation toward modernity, the magnificent creatures that had defined this frozen epoch started to face challenges unlike any they had encountered in their evolutionary history. The giants that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years in the cold steppes and tundra found themselves in a world that was changing faster than they could adapt, marking the beginning of one of the most profound extinction events our planet has ever witnessed. The mammoth herds, which had once stretched from horizon to horizon across the great steppes, began to dwindle as their preferred habitat slowly disappeared beneath advancing forests. You would have noticed the change gradually at first. Herds that seemed slightly smaller than your grandfather remembered, migration routes that no longer extended quite as far north as they once had. The vast grasslands that had sustained millions of these magnificent creatures were being replaced by woodlands where different rules of survival applied. Woolly rhinoceroses, those massive giants of the tundra, found their territories fragmenting as warming temperatures allowed trees to colonize areas that had been open grassland for millennia. These massive herbivores, so perfectly adapted to life in cold, open spaces, struggled to navigate through increasingly dense vegetation. Their broad feet, ideal for walking on soft tundra and snow, were less suited to the uneven terrain of forest floors littered with fallen logs and thick undergrowth. The changing climate created cascading effects throughout the Ice Age ecosystem. As the steppes shrank and forests expanded, the carefully balanced relationships between predator and prey began to unravel. Cave lions, which had evolved sophisticated hunting strategies for pursuing prey across open grasslands, found their techniques less effective in woodland environments where visibility was limited and ambush opportunities were different. Saber-toothed cats, those masters of the ambush hunt, faced particular challenges as their preferred prey species became increasingly rare. Their specialized anatomy, so perfectly suited for delivering precision strikes to large, thick-skinned herbivores, became less advantageous in a world where large prey was becoming scarce. But climate change was not the only pressure facing the Ice Age giants. Human populations were growing and spreading, armed with increasingly sophisticated hunting techniques and weapons.
Small bands of skilled hunters had learned to work together with deadly efficiency, using their intelligence and coordination to bring down even the largest prey. What had once been rare and dangerous hunts became more frequent and systematic as human communities developed specialized strategies for hunting megafauna.
You might have witnessed one of these hunts, a carefully orchestrated effort involving dozens of people working in perfect coordination. Hunters would study mammoth herds for days or weeks, learning their movement patterns and identifying vulnerable individuals. When the moment came, they would drive their chosen prey toward prepared ambush sites or natural obstacles, using fire and coordinated group tactics to overcome animals many times their individual size. The archaeological record tells us that these hunts were not just occasional events, but became an integral part of human survival strategy. At sites across the world, the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths show clear evidence of human butchery, often in quantities that suggest systematic hunting rather than opportunistic scavenging. As the Ice Age environment continued its transformation, many giant species found themselves caught in an impossible situation. The warming climate was eliminating their preferred habitats faster than they could adapt to new conditions, while growing human populations were placing increasing pressure on their already stressed communities. Some species managed survival by partial, adapting to new environments, or by finding refuge in regions where Ice Age conditions persisted longer. Bison populations contracted but survived in North America, though in much smaller numbers than their Ice Age ancestors. Muskoxen retreated to the Arctic, where they continue to thrive today as living reminders of the mammoth steppe ecosystem. The extinction of the Ice Age megafauna marked more than just the loss of individual species. It represented the end of entire ecosystems, the collapse of ecological relationships that had defined life on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years. The Great Migration ceased. The thunder of countless hooves fell silent, and the world became a quieter, smaller place, though one that would soon be filled with new forms of life adapted to warmer conditions. This twilight of the giants was both an ending and a beginning, marking the close of the Ice Age chapter of Earth's story and the opening of a new era in which smaller, more adaptable creatures would inherit the world that the megafauna left behind.
Deep in the permafrost of Siberia, frozen bodies of woolly mammoths emerge occasionally from thawing ground, so perfectly preserved that their fur still clings to their skin, and their stomachs contain the grasses they ate during final meals. These are not mere fossils, but actual flesh and bone from the Ice Age world, preserved in nature's deep freeze for millennia. In caves scattered across Europe, the artistic legacy of Ice Age humans still glows on stone walls. The famous paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet show mammoths, bison, horses, and cave lions rendered with skill and detail that make them seem ready to step off the rock surface. These images are windows into the minds of people who lived alongside great beasts. You would find it remarkable how these ancient artists understood anatomy and movement, depicting pregnant mares with swollen bellies, bison with thick winter coats, and mammoth herds in family groups that match what modern scientists know about their social behavior. The tools left behind tell stories of adaptation and ingenuity. Archaeological sites reveal carefully crafted spear points, bone needles, and carving implements that demonstrate sophisticated technology developed for survival. Perhaps the most remarkable archives are locked in the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. When scientists drill deep into these glaciers, they extract cores containing tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere, along with dust and ash from different seasons and years. Each layer records temperature, atmospheric composition, and major volcanic eruptions that occurred during the Ice Age. In sediments of ancient lake beds, pollen grains preserved the story of how vegetation changed as the Ice Age progressed. These microscopic capsules show how forests retreated and advanced, how grasslands expanded and contracted, and how entire ecosystems migrated across continents. The bones of Ice Age animals found in caves and tar pits provide evidence about this vanished world. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of bones from saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and giant ground sloths, showing not just what species lived, but how they interacted and how their populations changed. Even the landscape preserves Ice Age memories. The Great Lakes were carved by glaciers, their basins scoured by immense ice sheets. The fertile soils of the Midwest were deposited by Ice Age winds carrying dust from distant mountains. All of these traces create our understanding of the Ice Age world, each piece of evidence adding detail to the larger picture. This detective work continues today as new technologies reveal previously hidden aspects of Ice Age life and climate.
The Ice Age did not simply end and disappear without a trace. All around us, woven into the fabric of our modern world, are the living remnants and lasting influences of that frozen epoch. If you know where to look, you can still see the Ice Age's fingerprints on the landscape, still encounter its surviving children among the animals that share our planet, and still feel its influence in the very rhythms of our climate and seasons. In the Arctic regions of Alaska, northern Canada, and Siberia, musk oxen still gather in their ancient defensive circles when threatened, just as their ancestors did when cave lions stalked the Mammoth steppes. These shaggy, stocky animals are living links to the Ice Age world, virtually unchanged from the creatures that grazed alongside woolly mammoths. Their thick undercoat, called kivute, is still among the finest natural insulating materials on Earth, evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to protect them from temperatures that would kill most other large mammals. Caribou and reindeer continue their vast migrations across the tundra, following routes that were established during the Ice Age and refined over millennia of seasonal movement. When you watch footage of these great herds streaming across the northern landscape, you are seeing behavior patterns that stretch back to the time when similar herds shared the steppes with saber-toothed cats and giant bears. The timing of their movements, their social organization, even their physical adaptations, all echo the deep past. The landscape itself bears permanent scars and gifts from the Ice Age transformation. The Great Lakes, those inland seas that define much of the geography of North America, were carved directly by the weight and movement of glacial ice. Every time you see their vast blue expanses, you are looking at basins gouged out by ice sheets that were miles thick. The water that fills them includes meltwater that has been flowing from those ancient glaciers for thousands of years.
Across the American Midwest, farmers till soil that owes much of its incredible fertility to Ice Age processes. The rich black earth that feeds much of the world was created by thousands of years of wind-blown dust, ground fine by distant glaciers, and carried across continents by the powerful air currents of the Ice Age atmosphere. Every harvest grown in these soils is nourished by minerals that were pulverized by ice and transported by winds that no longer blow with the same fierce consistency. The fjords of Norway, Alaska, and Chile are perhaps the most dramatically visible remnants of Ice Age sculpting. These deep, narrow inlets were carved by glaciers that flowed down mountain valleys to the sea, their immense weight and grinding action creating some of the most spectacular coastal landscapes on Earth. When you stand at the edge of a fjord and look down into water that can be more than 1,000 feet deep, you are seeing the direct handiwork of Ice Age glaciers.
Even in regions that were never directly covered by ice, the influence of the Ice Age persists. The Mediterranean climate of California was partly shaped by the global climate patterns that the great ice sheets created. The seasonal rainfall patterns, the summer droughts, and the mild winters that characterize this region all reflect atmospheric circulation patterns that were established when vast areas of the northern continents were locked under ice. In the far north, permafrost still locks away vast quantities of organic matter that accumulated during the Ice Age. This permanently frozen soil contains the remains of mammoth steppe vegetation, preserving a record of that vanished ecosystem, while also storing enormous amounts of carbon that was removed from the atmosphere during the cold millennia. As climate change causes some of this permafrost to thaw, it releases both the preserved organic matter and the greenhouse gases it contains, creating a connection between the ancient Ice Age world and our modern climate challenges. Some of the most remarkable living traces of the Ice Age can be found in isolated populations of plants and animals that survived the Great Warming by retreating to refugia, where Ice Age conditions persisted. In the mountains of Central Asia, populations of wild horses that are nearly identical to their Ice Age ancestors still roam across steppes that echoed the mammoth steppes of the ancient world. Arctic foxes, virtually unchanged since the Pleistocene, still change their coats from brown to white with the seasons, adapting to environmental conditions that have persisted since the height of the last glaciation. The very concept of our modern seasons, the rhythm of our agricultural year, and the patterns of human settlement all reflect adaptations to the post-Ice Age world. The timing of plant growth, the breeding cycles of animals, and the seasonal movements of migratory species were all calibrated during the thousands of years of transition from Ice Age to modern conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, genetic studies have revealed that many modern species carry within their DNA the signatures of Ice Age population bottlenecks and expansions. The genetic diversity patterns of everything from brown bears to oak trees reflect the challenges their ancestors faced during the Ice Age cycles, when populations were repeatedly compressed into small refugia and then expanded again as conditions improved. In the deepest sense, we ourselves are products of the Ice Age. The human species was forged in the crucible of Ice Age survival, developing the intelligence, cooperation, and technological innovation that define us today. Our capacity for rapid cultural adaptation, our ability to thrive in diverse environments, and our sophisticated tool-making abilities all evolved in response to the challenges of living in the Ice Age world. Even now, As we face our own period of rapid climate change, we can look to the Ice Age for lessons about resilience, adaptation, and the intricate connections between climate, landscape, and life.
Our long journey through the Ice Age world draws to a gentle close, like the slow retreat of those ancient glaciers themselves. We have walked together across frozen steppes where mammoth herds thundered beneath endless skies, stood in the shadow of ice sheets that stretched beyond every horizon, and warmed ourselves by the fires of our earliest ancestors as they carved the first tools and painted the first images on cave walls. Now it is time to return, step by step, to the world we know today. The Ice Age is not truly gone. It lives on in the valleys carved by patient glaciers, in the fertile soils that feed our crops, in the great lakes that dot the northern continents. It persists in the musk oxen of the Arctic tundra, in the seasonal migrations of caribou, in the very rhythms of our climate and weather. Every breath we take connects us to that ancient atmosphere. Every landscape we see bears the signature of those transformative millennia when ice and cold reshaped the face of our planet. As you settle back into the present moment, perhaps you can feel some echo of that deep time, that sense of geological patience that measured change not in years but in millennia. The Ice Age teaches us about resilience and adaptation, about the extraordinary creativity of life in finding ways to survive and thrive even in the most challenging conditions. It reminds us that our planet has always been a dynamic, changing place, never static, always in motion between different states of being. The humans who lived through those frozen ages were not so different from us. They faced uncertainty and change with the same mixture of fear and ingenuity that we bring to our own challenges. They cared for their families, told stories around their fires, and looked up at the same stars we see tonight, though perhaps with greater clarity through the thin, cold air of their ice-bound world. Their legacy lives on in our capacity for innovation, our ability to adapt to new circumstances, and our deep social bonds that helped them survive in conditions that would test any individual beyond their limits. There is something profoundly peaceful about connecting with this vast sweep of time, this reminder that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives. The Ice Age world existed for hundreds of thousands of years, supporting countless generations of humans and animals, witnessing the slow dance of glaciers advancing and retreating, the patient accumulation of snow that became ice that carved continents. In the face of such immensity, our daily concerns find a different perspective, settling into a quieter, more manageable proportion. The great herds that once moved across the Mammoth steppes have mostly vanished now, but their memory lives on in the landscapes they helped create, in the evolutionary adaptations of their descendants, and in the cave paintings where human hands captured their majesty for us to discover thousands of years later. The saber-toothed cats and cave lions, the dire wolves and giant bears have all faded into fossil and bone, but they played their parts in the grand drama of life on Earth, contributing their own chapters to the ongoing story of adaptation and survival. As the Ice Age world gave way to our warmer modern climate, it created opportunities for new forms of life to flourish. The retreating glaciers left behind fresh ground for forests to colonize, new rivers for fish to populate,
and eventually the conditions that would allow human civilization to develop agriculture, build cities, and create the complex societies we know today. We are the inheritors of that great transformation, living in a world that was literally shaped by ice and time. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine yourself as part of that long chain of sleepers stretching back through history. Humans who lay down to sleep in mammoth bone shelters while the aurora danced overhead, who dreamt their dreams while the wind whispered across endless expanses of snow and grass. Their hopes and fears, their love for their families, their wonder at the natural world around them, all flow forward through time to connect with our own experience of being alive on this remarkable planet. The Ice Age reminds us that change is the only constant, that adaptation is life's greatest strength, and that even the most challenging conditions can give rise to extraordinary beauty and complexity. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the patience of glaciers, the resilience of Ice Age survivors, and the quiet knowledge that you are part of Earth's ongoing story, a story that stretches back through the frozen past and forward into an unknowable but promising future. The Ice Age world sleeps now beneath our modern landscape, but its dreams continue in every valley carved by ancient ice, every fertile field nourished by glacial dust, and every breath we take in this world that those frozen millennia helped create. Rest well, knowing you are cradled by deep time itself.